Why is it that some Christians want to believe science as opposed to the Bible?
People don't want to feel like they're left out, and so there's this attempt to mix science and a secular interpretation of science into the Bible.
But the Bible doesn't allow us to do that.
If science is properly interpreted, then the biblical account makes sense. The Bible should come first, and we should interpret the science based on the biblical account. We're out there saying to people that you can trust the Bible, and because you can trust the Bible, you can trust the gospel message that the Bible has.
Trust the God of the Bible.
Trust the God of the Bible.
Welcome to 24/6 with Mark James from Creation Ministries International. And we did promise in our introductory session that we're going to talk about the gap theory today, but it's trying to squeeze millions of years into the biblical text is where the problem lies.
Absolutely. That's what all of these different interpretations of Genesis are trying to do.
Yeah. The gap theory says that there is a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2.
Yes.
And there's many people that believe that. Why do they believe that?
Because they're trying to fit science and a secular interpretation of science into the Bible. And people get themselves into a position where if you don't take the Genesis account as history, then either the Genesis account is completely wrong, or you've somehow got to reinterpret the text. And that's what they're trying to do.
What, like allegorical?
Allegorical, or some people say it's poetry. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And this gap theory is just one of those ways.
It's amazing. I spoke one time to when I was on Rima on the radio, and I spoke to a professor of Hebrew. He was one of the world authorities on ancient Hebrew. He wasn't a believer, but he was an authority on ancient Hebrew. I said, what does the writer of Genesis 1 want us to believe? And he said, Genesis 1 is written in some of the most simple Hebrew that there is. It's Janet and John in Hebrew. He says, the writer wants you to believe that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. Now, we know this is rubbish because it all evolved. You know, this is what this guy's saying. He says, but the writer wants you to believe, and he uses things like numbers for the days. It was day 1, day 2. He uses the construct of evening and morning to say this was 6 literal 24-hour days. So I go, okay, I've got this secular professor telling me this, secular professor of Hebrew telling me this, but Joe Smith down at the local church says, no, it's not right.
Yeah. And that's one of the big issues, I suppose, is that people who have a little bit of information think that they know better than people that have a lot of information. And there's a famous quote from a professor at Oxford University, James Barr, I think his name was, who said he didn't know of any any expert in Hebrew grammar who didn't believe that the writer of Genesis was intending that people understand it as 6 days, 6,000 years ago, and a worldwide flood.
Yeah, and apparently the grammar, because I mean we think for most of the people watching this or listening to this, we're thinking in English with a Western mindset, but apparently the grammar of the Hebrew there between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 doesn't allow. There is no pause. There
is no pause. Absolutely no pause.
Not even a comma.
No, and in fact, the way it's constructed, there is a Hebrew word vav, which basically is like and. But if that is followed by a non-verb, it doesn't mean and, it means more now. It's almost like the next part of the sentence is in parenthesis.
Right.
So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then, so rather than being a gap, it's just saying, and this is what it was like, in parentheses almost.
Yeah, so it's all part of the one.
That
again, the Hebrew grammar with that just completely eliminates the possibility of a gap.
It does.
But yeah, people still believe in a gap. The other one is the day age, and I have trouble with this. Well, I have trouble with the gap theory too, but the belief that each of the days is an eon or a long period of time.
Yes. And again, all of these theories are relatively new. In fact, most of them have been introduced within the last 200 years.
Now, that's not saying that the theory of evolution is new, that because for thousands of years people have believed that the Earth was old and everything, but trying to mix it into the Bible.
Into the Bible, that's right. These alternative interpretations of Genesis are all relatively recent. And what a lot of people don't really, they don't go there. They don't realise that only one of these interpretations can be true, because they all compete with one another.
Yeah.
They all have different understandings. The people who believe one particular interpretation of Genesis, they're very quick to point out all the problems with all the other interpretations, while at the same time they can ignore completely the issues with their own.
Yeah.
And so the gap theory people will say, oh no, you can't take the days as long ages because the text doesn't allow you to. Whereas the day age people will say, well, you can't fit a gap into Genesis 1.1, 1.2 because the text doesn't allow you to. The day age theory, again, it's introduced to try and fit millions of years, and the idea of the millions of years from the secular science point of view is that we have all these layers of rock around the world, and they're filled with fossils, and secular science has dated those rocks as they do to millions of years old. What people don't realise is that by introducing these different interpretations is you're putting all these fossils, which are dead things, during the creation week or before the creation week, which means that death happened before the fall.
Yes.
And that's the big problem with virtually all of these interpretations, is that death is introduced before the fall. And for that reason, then, the whole gospel message starts to collapse in on itself.
Yeah, well, when Romans, Paul talks about, sin ended through one man and death through sin.
Yes.
And he's talking about the one man. And I mean, I've had a recent, shall we be nice and call it a discussion online with this, that the one man there is talking about Adam.
Yes.
So sin did not enter before Adam. Death did not enter before sin. Therefore, how can you have millions of dead things before Adam ate the fruit?
Yes. And the only way they can get around that is to say that Adam's death was a spiritual death. But then why did Jesus have to die physically? So again, the whole gospel message is jeopardized simply by trying to allegorize Genesis.
So the day age theory says that each of the biblical days in Genesis 1 are
long
periods of time. How does that not work?
Okay, so you end up with, on day 3, plants are created. But the sun isn't created till day 4. So for millions of years, those plants had to survive without the sun. And then the flying creatures weren't created until later, which means all the pollinating insects weren't available to pollinate those plants.
Yep.
So you start to tie yourselves up in knots simply to try and introduce these long days. And it just doesn't work.
I remember you've got with Creation Ministries, there's a series of DVDs called Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution with Dr. Job Martin. And he talks initially about how he was lecturing. He's a dentist, and he was lecturing on how the scales moved up and became teeth and things like that. And 2 of his students who were Christians just humbly went to him and said, Dr. Martin, have you ever checked the assumptions of evolution, which he'd never done? And so, of course, he went off and did that and discovered creation. But he talks about the vanilla plant and the manipula bee. I think it's manipula bee, which is the only bee that can pollinate the vanilla plant.
Yeah.
And isn't it just lucky that they evolved at the same time? Yeah. However, if we're doing day age, they can't have. They're millions of years apart.
Absolutely. They're separated so far apart that they just couldn't have any effect on one another.
Yeah.
So that's, and again, somehow these people that like the day age interpretation, they manage to actually push these things out of the way and just say, look, I believe this, and that's good enough.
Yeah.
But the problem is that when you then go to the rest of the Bible, that's when it all starts to fall to pieces.
It falls apart.
Yeah.
It does, doesn't it? It's not like missing out an ingredient when you're making a cake and you take it out of the oven and it just crumbles. You go, what did I do wrong?
Yes.
And your theology does that as well. One of the big things with the sun on day 4 is, well, hang on, God created light. How can there be light before the sun? And I go, I don't know. Ask a firefly.
Yes.
You know, ask an anglerfish. You know?
Yes. And the thing is that secular science now tells us
Yes.
that light was created before the sun.
Yeah.
Because the sun came into existence apparently 4.6 billion years ago,
Yep.
but light already existed. So so often we see that eventually science catches up
Yeah.
with the Bible.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that more and more.
I think it was also something that's, and again, you can't take away the fact that these many evolutionary scientists are very, very smart people. Very
Yes.
smart. They're just missing that key factor that there is a God.
Yep.
And they refuse to admit that. But I think from memory, even with the Big Bang Theory, they have said that light was created within milliseconds of the Big Bang.
Yep.
So the Big Bang, everything was created first, and then there was light. And I go, I think I've read that somewhere.
Sounds familiar.
It
Yes.
does. So again, the problem with the gap theory, the day age theory, with anything but the literal 24-hour, 6-day creation theory, is that once you start reading the rest of Scripture, it breaks down and you lose things.
Yes, and probably the best example is in Exodus, Exodus 20 verses 9 to 11. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, and the 7th day is a Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all that is in them. So in Genesis 1 we read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And in Exodus, the 6 days of our working week are designed to be to show people that
Yes.
the days of creation. And so we have 6 days. Our working week, do we have a big gap between the first and the second days of our working week? No, we don't.
No.
Are the
And
days...
we don't work for 6 millennium
No,
before
but,
taking a break.
I mean, are the days long ages? No, they're not. They might seem like they are sometimes,
yeah.
but they're not.
Yeah.
And whenever we have a problem with interpreting a passage of Scripture, the first place we should look for clarification is elsewhere in Scripture. And all of these alternative interpretations of Genesis fall down when you start looking at the rest of Scripture.
And as you said at the beginning of this session, that almost all of those are post-Darwinian.
Yes. Well, not even post-Darwinian, but there was a guy by the name of Hutton who introduced uniformitarianism, which is basically, in geology, what we see happening today is what's happened throughout history.
Right.
And in effect, what he was doing was taking things like the flood.
So slow processes, long ages.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's where it all started. And then once there was enough time, that's when Darwin's theory of evolution started to make a little bit more sense to these
kick in,
people,
okay.
because you need lots of time for evolution.
For that to happen. Well, maybe we can look at that next time. Why
Yes, we
not?
can.
So I hope you can join us for 24/6 and hit subscribe and like so that the bell rings when we put a new episode up, and just check our other podcasts as well.